So on behalf of the Sakıp Sabancı Center for Turkish Studies, I'd like to welcome everybody here to the 2022 Sakıp Sabancı Lecture by Professor Zeynep Çelik. My name's John Huber. I'm a political science professor here at Columbia, and I'm currently the interim director of the center. And I wanted to say a few thank yous before we get started with the main event. And I guess the first thank you, I don't know who to thank, but it's for us being here together in this room. The pandemic has also obviously been a challenging couple of years for us. We haven't had a Sakıp Sabancı lecture in person for 3 years now. And I'm very grateful for how the pandemic helped us understand the potential of having remote audiences better than we did before the pandemic. And I'm very grateful to the people who are joining us as part of the audience remotely, but I'm also happy to be in 3 dimensions myself. So maybe we thank the scientists for that, but it's great to have an in-person event. I also wanted to say a couple of thank yous from the perspective of my role as interim director, which basically means I'm helping out as we go from one real director to a second real director. And the first thank you is to Professor Holger Klein. He was the founding director of the Sakıp Sabancı Center. Over the last few years, he was the person who had the energy and the creativity and the commitment to get the thing off the ground. And we're all really grateful for his leadership and have never really had a chance to thank him properly. The second thank you goes to Professor Neslihan Şenocuk. Is Nesli here? On Zoom, Nesli. I'd like to have you stand up on Zoom, please. Nesli is a professor of history and is going to be the next director of the Sakıp Sabancı Center starting this summer. And she has the energy and ideas and commitment that are going to take us to the next level. So we're really grateful to her for agreeing to do this. Thank you, Nesli. My third thank you is to some members of the staff, Astrid Benedict and Nararat Shakarian, who have really helped us organize events like this, but also think about how to make the events better, both logistically and intellectually as well. So very deep thanks to them. And my final personal thanks is to Professor Tunç Şen and to Zeynep Çelik, because in his capacity as deputy director and in her capacity as a visiting Sakıp Sabancı professor, they have been the 2 people this last year who have organized all the exciting events at the center, including the film series, including some seminars on the history of Ottoman studies. And without them, there wouldn't have had these kinds of activities. So thanks very much to both of you. Finally, the biggest thanks goes to the family, the Sakıp Sabancı family, for the extraordinary gift that made this Center for Turkish Studies possible and that made this event possible. And this event is one way that we not only honor the gift, but that we remind ourselves of the obligation we have from it to enhance Turkish studies in the world. And so we're grateful for that opportunity, and I can't think of a better way to do it than with the lecture by Professor Çelik today. So before we get started, I wanted to remind everyone, as if they need it, that there's a reception afterwards, and we hope that you will stay. I also wanted to remind people there'll be an opportunity for questions after the lecture. But let's get on with it. To introduce Professor Çelik, we have Professor Timothy Mitchell, who is, I'm sorry, there's a lot, Professor of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and Africa Studies, and of International and Public Affairs. Professor Mitchell is a leading scholar on Middle Eastern studies, and we're grateful that he's going to introduce Professor Çelik. Thank you.
Thank you, John, and thank you to the Sakıp Sabancı Center for this invitation to introduce our speaker. Zeynep Çelik received her bachelor's degree in architecture at Istanbul Technical University in 1975, a professional architecture degree at Rice University in Texas, and then a PhD from Berkeley. She taught for a long period of her career at the New Jersey Institute of Technology, where she was appointed both in the Department of History and the School of Architecture, rising to the rank of Distinguished Professor, and where she is now Distinguished Professor Emerita. This year, she is, I believe, the inaugural Sakıp Sabancı Visiting Professor at the center here at Columbia and in the Department of History. I first encountered Zeynep in a banquet hall in San Francisco in November of 1984. The reason she and I were attending a banquet was it was the annual MESA meetings, and our dissertations, hers, mine, and that of another person with us today, Laila Abulugat, have been nominated for the prize for the best dissertation. I won honorable mention. And Laila in social sciences and Zeynep in humanities won the actual prizes. This was, of course, a difficult thing in a way to live with. I dealt with it on the side of the social sciences prize by persuading Laila to marry me. Zeynep, I've just had to admire from afar. And it hasn't been difficult to do that. Her dissertation that won that prize went on to be the basis for a remarkable first book, a book that introduced a scholarly career that over time marked her out as one of America's most distinguished historians of architecture. Last year, she was elected as a fellow of the Society of Architectural Historians in recognition, as the terms of the fellowship say, of a lifetime achievement in that field. She is, of course, much more than just an architectural historian. She has contributed much more widely to fields of Ottoman history and historiography, to urban studies, to the history of archaeology. And for more than a generation, she has shaped the entire study of the modern Ottoman city and Ottoman urbanism, not just in Istanbul, but across the Ottoman Arab world. And in that field, she is the preeminent scholar. Her first book, based on that dissertation, The Remaking of Istanbul, Portrait of an Ottoman City in the 19th Century, was immediately recognized. Indeed, these were the terms of one of the reviews published as the best study of the making of a modern Middle Eastern study. The terms were actually used by Janet Abulugat, who in the very same year that she became my mother-in-law, it turns out. So this group of admirers was expanding rapidly as her work became known. It was a remarkable book, and still is, a study of the distinctive aesthetic forms of Turkish modernity, which for too long had been wrongly understood by European American scholars in the same way they always understood modernity in places where they had little knowledge of the language, the cultures, the history of a place as some kind of second-hand modernity, as an imitation of something that occurred elsewhere. And to counter this, the book had to undertake not just a study of the visual and spatial forms of the development of Istanbul as a modern city, but a much wider analysis of the city's commercial and industrial transformation in the 19th century, its modern apparatus of law, of planning, and so much more. And it was that breadth of analysis that marked it out as such a distinctive contribution to the field. She had another brilliant book in 1992, displaying the Orient, Architecture and Islam at 19th Century World Fairs, a subject in which I was also interested in, published a brief article, and she turned this topic into an entire book, examining how the West represented the cultures and ways of life of Islam, but showing how you could do that through the field of the history of architecture by focusing on the architectural exhibitions at those world's fairs, and this trying to understand this European desire with both sort of miniaturizing and perfectly representing an entire civilization, and at the same time transforming it into some fantasy of the Orient, of the European imagination. It's a wonderful book. She worked well beyond the history of Istanbul and of the Ottoman Center, and published books on Algiers, on Algiers under French rule, and then another book after that, Empire, Architecture and the City, which won the Spiro Kostoff Book Award of the Society of Architectural Historians, an award named after her mentor, I believe, at Berkeley. I don't want to take much longer, because if I went through the rest of her CV, I would be taking time that you'd much rather spend hearing her. There was a long series of edited books, a brilliant number of articles, a range of work in the profession, a series of awards, of prizes, of honorary degrees that have recognized her throughout her career. And I'm delighted to be able to introduce her today. And I invite you, as we listen to her talk, which is entitled Antiquities, Museums, Empires, I invite you to join me in welcoming the 2022 Sakıp Sabancı lecturer, Professor Zeynep Çelik.
I'll tell you when to get there. Not yet. Oh, well, all right. Why don't we start? Thank you, Professor Mitchell, Tim, for this kind and generous introduction. This morning, indeed, I was thinking about how the three of us got together somehow. Luck brought us together in 1986 it was, yes. So nice memories. I am most grateful to Sakıp Sabancı family for their profound commitment to education and scholarship, as well as to so many other worthy causes. And of course, for their monumental endowment, the Sakıp Sabancı Center at Columbia University. I acknowledge Güler Sabancı's pioneering role with heartful appreciation. We are very happy to have her with us today. I would like to thank the center's interim director, Professor John Huber, its deputy director, Professor Tunç Şen, and its program managers, Astrid Benedict, and the much appreciated Ararat Şekeryan, without whom we couldn't do anything. I also owe a big thank you to the history department for accommodating me, and to the students in my Politics of Archaeology seminar this semester. Their passionate interest in the topic re-energizes me every week. Intertwined with politics, antiquities are hot everyday topics. The destruction of the historic heritage and the restitution of objects from Western museums to their places of origin, both widely covered in the media, are accompanied by fiery debates on who owns antiquity and whose culture is it anyway. Turning to the late 19th, early 20th century Ottoman Empire, I would like to take you to the origins of the controversies and battles over antiquities. A painting by Jean-Baptiste Hilaire, prominently displayed in the permanent galleries of the Pera Museum in Istanbul, and innocently titled "The New Mosque and Istanbul Harbor," tells us a story that goes well beyond its depiction of the famous view of the historic peninsula. In the foreground, antiquities lie on an embankment ready to be shipped to France. A robot being loaded by local workers and under the supervision of a European man carries the fragments to a larger boat that's anchored at a distance. I hope you see what I'm talking about on the screen in the foreground there. Huh?
I can't see in the camera. Sorry about that.
Technical problems. Meanwhile, if you can identify the antiquities there, that would be great. The canvas's subtitle describes this action explicitly. If we translate it into English, it reads something like the departure of antique fragments collected in Greece by Count Choiseul-Gouffier, the ambassador of the king to the Ottoman port in 1789 on their way to France. Count de Choiseul-Gouffier, the French ambassador to the Ottoman Empire from 1784 to 1792, was an avid collector and a devoted student of archaeology. The artist Lerner was a close associate of Choiseul-Gouffier. Accompanying him on his 1776 expedition to Greece and Asia Minor, Lerner had illustrated Choiseul-Gouffier's Voyage pittoresque de la Grèce, whose first volume was published in 1872. During his tenure in Istanbul, the ambassador had convinced Sultan Abdülhamid I to issue him a firman, an imperial edict, granting permission to remove some fragments from the Acropolis. The firman allowed Choiseul-Gouffier to amass an impressive collection, which was first sent to Istanbul for cataloging before being shipped to France. Lerner's painting documents the departure of this collection. A century later, such a transparent operation would not have been possible. By then, the Ottoman position toward antiquities had shifted dramatically. The government had claimed ownership of the land's multi-layered heritage and begun to play a key role in the development of its own archaeology and museology. Of course, appropriation of heritage had always existed in the region. Manifested in a multitude of ways, this included everyday practices by ordinary people in counter-argument to Western conceptions that ancient civilizations carried no meaning for local residents. I will not dwell on the multitudes of ways in which local communities valorized the past. I will focus instead on the official strategies developed and undertaken by the Ottoman state as measures against European and American interests in the historical wealth of the empire. Ottomans were not welcome actors in the field of archaeology and museology for perhaps understandable reasons. Their forceful entry through a series of laws enacted in 1869, 1874, 1884, and 1906 increasingly restricted the activities. This is not moving. I wanted to show you the first of these laws, but I can't move my arrow. Isn't this one? Oh, it's this. No, it's not moving. So what do I have to do?
Just press the arrow if you want to move forward.
This one, okay.
You want to go on the back.
All right, okay. All right. So these legal provisions increasingly restricted the activities of European and American archaeologists, imposed mandatory permissions for any kind of work within the imperial boundaries, controlled operations in the field, and banned the exportation of antiquities. In an essay dating from 1883, on the eve of the planned changes to the 1874 laws, French archaeologist Solomon Reynac reflected a view commonly shared by Western scholars when he voiced strong opposition to the tightening of Ottoman attitudes towards antiquities. Published in the widely circulated Revue de Deux Mondes under the catchy title, Le Vandalisme moderne en Orient, the article's central argument maintained that, quote, the antiquities of the Greco-Roman Orient were of no interest to their new masters, the Turks, and that Europe, the heir to the civilization of Greeks, had to impose the responsibility and the honor of taking back the monuments from them, unquote. According to Reynac, besides not having any interest in these antiquities, the Ottoman state did not have the necessary resources for their required preservation and maintenance, and the new Ottoman laws were unfair to European researchers. The Turkish race, he argued, had its own national art, which had nothing to do with the Greco-Roman past. Reynac's calls did not resonate on the Ottoman front. If anything, it had the reverse effect. Under the leadership of Osman Hamdi Bey, a prominent intellectual, artist, self-educated archaeologist, and director of the Imperial Museum, the historic wealth found in the empire's far-flung territories was appropriated into official cultural heritage. Here you see him in his role as an archaeologist, and I thought I should show you a painting by him depicting an archaeological site. This one is in Mesopotamia. The most visible symbol of the development was the construction of a neoclassical building for the Imperial Museum of Antiquities in Istanbul, designed by Alexandre Valory and opened in 1891. With its centerpiece being the sarcophagi from Sidon, excavated by Osman Hamdi Bey himself, the museum was to house pieces from all over the empire and serve as a platform for international scholarly debate. Hamdi Bey's personal and passionate identification with the museum is famously echoed in his words. It's in French. He spoke more French than Turkish, I believe. He said, "Il n'y a pas de bassesse que je ne passe pour mon musée." There isn't any baseness that I wouldn't do for my museum. However, his efforts were not geared toward the local public. They targeted instead a small international group of academics on whom he realized to publicize his work. The Western archaeologists, in turn, were forced to comply with Hamdi Bey's wishes. As he had the keys to their research, he decided on the permissions to dig and had the excavation site supervised. Very powerful man. The Imperial Museum's collections entered the academic discourse very quickly, making a spectacular debut with the contribution of the Sidon sarcophagi to the debates on polychromy in antiquity. The original paint on the sarcophagi had survived, serving as strong evidence to the use of color in antiquity. The 1874 law had designated local provincial authorities as gatekeepers to control the activities of foreign archaeologists who had permissions, and stipulated that all findings were to be divided between the archaeologists, the Imperial Museum, and the owner of the land on which they were found. Subsequent reports from the Ministry of Education indicate the appointment of a government official to oversee significant excavation sites. This photo is really telling. It depicts all the actors on the scene: foreign archaeologists in their white costumes, an Ottoman officer clearly distinguishable with his dress, and local workers. The 1884 law revised the partage policy by requiring that all objects found on the site be documented and given over in their entirety to the museum. It also inserted another level of supervision by requiring a delegate of government officers acquainted with the necessary knowledge to assist on excavation sites. This became a large nuisance for foreign teams and on several levels. An article particularly hostile to Hamdi Bey's strict surveillance of antiquities argued that Ottoman public servants in the provinces could be bought for money on any occasion, except on the subject of antiquities. The consequences were sad for scholarly societies like the American Institute of Archaeology, which was ready to spend, quote, thousands on the excavation at Babylon, for example, and now be expected to be content with the honor and glory of enriching Hamdi's museum without acquiring one iota for themselves, unquote. In New York Times' relatively more temperate language, the most disagreeable thing was that a Turkish official had to accompany any expedition to take charge of all the objects found. Foreign archaeologists now had to accommodate an individual whose unique job was to watch their activities. Furthermore, aside from places where digs were carried out, all antique sites were to be guarded by government appointees. Prompted by certain unfortunate events, among them the lifting of several sculptures by German archaeologist Karl Lehmann, authorities in Istanbul took one further step to prevent looting. Until then, the directors of education, who were the highest officers of the Ministry of Education in the provinces, were held responsible for keeping an eye on the activities of foreigners and reporting back to the ministry. However, as these public servants worked in cities, they could not successfully carry out their duties on many sites. The net of potential overseers was cast much wider to include civil service personnel, such as governors and district head officials, kaymakams, as well as high school principals in larger settlements, middle school teachers in smaller towns, directors of sub-districts, and police and gendarmes. The slide shows the American archaeologists in Sardis, being visited by the kaymakam, and they complained a lot about this one particular visit. A regulation on the duties and responsibilities of guards shows the intended level of supervision on foreigners. The guards were to accompany the visitors during the entirety of their time on the grounds and make sure they did not take even the smallest of stones, did not photograph the sites and the old fragments, and did not make casts. This high level of surveillance even encompassed railroad construction. In concessions given to foreign companies to build railroads, the regulations stipulated that the museum in Istanbul should be immediately notified and laws applied if antiquities were found. This meant that otherwise lowly construction workers were charged with keeping an eye on antiquities. Under guidance from the Directorate of the Imperial Museum in Istanbul, the Ottoman Ministry of Education had thus created a much dreaded force of public servants for Western archaeologists, a network of espionage, in the words of an American observer. The Imperial Museum benefited from these measures. To accommodate its growing collections, it was expanded twice between 1899 and 1908, resulting in a U-shaped building set around a 16th century pavilion, the tiled kiosk that was used as part of the museum. Let me try to explain this a little better for you. Okay, so the old museum This is the 16th century kiosk. And here is the boundary of the first museum, and then you see the extensions, which came rather quickly. And I have two rather nice photographs. One of them here is showing the tiled kiosk on the left and the new museum building on the right with its stairs going up. And here is a view from the interior of the museum. The museum also served as the center from which all archaeological activities were regulated. Furthermore, it conducted its own excavations, most famously by Osman Hamdi Bey in Sidon in 1887 to 1888, resulting in the unearthing of the spectacular sarcophagi, as I mentioned earlier. These discoveries were documented and the process of their discovery described in a meticulously produced publication, Une nécropole royale à Sidon, fouille de Hamdi Bey. It was his experience in Sidon that urged Hamdi Bey to expand the concept of a museum. As the region's residents crowded the gates of the excavation site, expressing a sincere curiosity in its findings, Hamdi Bey was inspired to create an alternative true museum, a garden of antiquities, in his words, in a citrus grove where the artistic wonders were being temporarily stored. Open to the public on Friday and Sunday mornings, the displays attracted many people. Simultaneously, the excavation site itself turned into a platform for festivities. Unfortunately, I could not find any photographs of these events, so please use your imagination. On one single day toward the end of the excavation process, a day that was marked by the unearthing of yet another beautiful sarcophagus, Hamdi Bey acceded to the wishes of his workers and invited a group of musicians. Music accompanied work, and a crowd of 400 to 500 people gathered around the trench, joining the workers in a spontaneous outburst of excitement when the sarcophagus was taken out. These are the terms that were used in describing the event. We may never know who these musicians were or what kind of music they played, but we can imagine that the vernacular tunes and chants were most likely not in accord with Hamdi Bey's own taste in classical European music. Even so, the joy of local residents in their land and their past added to the archaeologist's pride in his discovery. Osman Hamdi Bey was by no means a populist, but his gesture marks quite a different tone than that of the foreign archaeologist, who showed only contempt for local people's interest in their work. The attitude of John Punnett Peters, who was digging in Nippur, Mesopotamia, is representative. The image on the screen shows the site in Nippur. Peter complained of Arabs, sometimes a whole tribe at a time, making unwarranted visits to the excavation site to catch glimpses of the tunnels, wells, and galleries. He interpreted their curiosity not as an interest in the history of their land, but as all at an admiration of the foreigner's ingenuity in discovering such marvels. Yet, read against the grain, Peter's perspective reveals a local pride in the history, since the archaeologist himself likened the visits to those that, in quotes, we would take to a museum. Hamdi Bey's idea of an outdoor museum caught on. To give one prominent example, Baalbek had made the news with the visit of Kaiser Wilhelm II in 1898, memorialized by a plaque from, my pronunciation is leaving me, memorialized by a plaque placed on a wall in the Temple of Jupiter. Opened with much fanfare and photographed profusely, the inscription celebrated Ottoman-German occupation, cooperation, and the friendship between Wilhelm II and Abdülhamid II. And on the right, you see the plaque placed on the wall, on the wall in the Temple of Jupiter. Now, travel to Baalbek was facilitated by railroad lines, and the Ottoman press reported that thousands of foreign travelers came every year, spending considerable amounts of money. The site is marked in red there, and Beirut is right on the waterfront to the west of that site. And on the, oh, let me see if I messed up. On the right, we have a watercolor by Roberts, which he had made during his visit to Baalbek, and he has a whole series of these. I will show you a few postcards, a couple of postcards from Baalbek, accentuating its touristic importance. A new avenue of internal travel was opened up when tourism writing was reoriented toward Ottomans through articles that read like short, inviting travelogues filled with practical tips in the popular press. And you're looking at one on the screen from Servet-i Fünun. Nevertheless, tourism came with problems. Osman Hamdi had angrily noted that visitors wrote on the walls and the columns, leaving them covered in large letters with the names of, I'm quoting Osman Hamdi Bey, French, English, Russian, and American scholars, ministers, ambassadors, gallant ladies, and all kinds of travelers, unquote. To protect the monuments, he had to take serious administrative measures. Security was increased, the compound was closed off with a fence, and entrance tickets were issued. In addition, a separate museum building was dedicated to the display of small-scale objects in a rather primitive and crowded manner, not matching by any means the order and grandeur of the Istanbul Museum. On the right, you're looking at the interior of this little pavilion in Baalbek. In the footsteps of the 1884 law, an 1889 legislation specified the need to create regional museums. Subsequently, plans were made to open museums in Salonika, Sivas in central Anatolia, and Izmir in western Anatolia. The intent to endow the key urban centers of the empire with such institutions surfaces again in the appointment of honorary museum directors, as in Mosul, Aleppo, and Jerusalem, even when museums did not yet exist. The materialization of these regional museums did not happen seamlessly, though. Regulations designated high school buildings to store antiquities. Newly found artifacts were to be transported to nearby high schools where they would be photographed. The most important would then be sent to the Imperial Museum in Istanbul, while the rest would be exhibited in high school courtyards. Accordingly, in Konya, Bursa, and Jerusalem, museums were appended to high schools, idadis. The latter dating from the 1880s and the 1890s in the aftermath of the 1869 education reforms. I'm showing you the high school in Konya on the left and Bursa on the right, substantial buildings, as you can see. Referred to as branches of the Imperial Museum and inaugurated during the first years of the 20th century, these museums were either situated in independent buildings in school gardens or directly inside high school buildings. For a period of their economic hardship, this seems like a wise strategy, especially because the Imperial Museum operated under the auspices of the Ministry of Education. The educational reforms, the integration of world history, Tarihi Umumi, to Ottoman history, Tarihi Osmani, in the curricula, the explosion in school construction, the building of the new quarters of the Imperial Museum in Istanbul, and the civilizational values associated with museology were all closely knit pieces of an important aspect of late Ottoman modernity. The museum in Konya was inaugurated in December 1899 in a one-story building specifically designed for this function and located in the gated school garden. On the right side of the gate, the museum could be accessed by a path lined with antique sculptures and architectural fragments. This perfect museum, constructed on a large budget, according to a communication from the governor of Konya, was intended to be the destination for historic objects found throughout the province. By the time of its openings, its single exhibition hall contained about 70 objects from the Roman, Byzantine, and Seljuk eras. For Gustav Mandel, who wrote a catalog for the Bursa branch of the Imperial Museum in 1908, the Konya Museum remained modest in comparison to its younger counterpart in Bursa. The Imperial Museum in Bursa occupied a new building in the so-called charming garden of the high school, and it was inaugurated in September of 1904 to correspond to the anniversary of Abdülhamid II's accession to the throne. Reached by a stone-paved path defined by pine trees and flower beds, the cubic structure consisted of 2 halls, one on each side of the entrance. One hall was reserved for Islamic antiquities, while the other offered the most precious Greek, Roman, and Byzantine objects. Antiquities of secondary importance were placed in the garden and along the pathways leading to the entrance. The Imperial Museum in Jerusalem, whose Ottoman era stretches from 1901 to 1917, began inside a high school building. The institution, as you may know, ultimately became the British Museum of Antiquities and then the Rockefeller Museum from 1939 on. We forget that its origins go back to the Imperial Museum days. 3 men played instrumental roles in its creation. Osman Hamdi Bey from Istanbul, Ismail Bey, the director of the Jerusalem Department of Public Instruction, and Frederick John Bliss, an archaeologist and son of the founder of the American College in Beirut. The decision to have a local museum in Jerusalem dated from 1899 and came from Istanbul. Bliss, who worked at the time for the Palestine Exploration Fund, supported the idea. In doing so, he opposed PEF, which considered itself the sole guardian of antiquities in Palestine. Bliss argued that the museum would be good for archaeology in general and for the PEF in particular, as it would allow the travelers see the results of the fund's own work. Having already committed himself to help with the arrangement of objects, Bliss underlined the importance of cooperation with the Ottoman authorities to ensure that the displays were designed according to established museum practices. This meant that the objects should be preserved in cases instead of lying around on the floor. With Ismail Bey's promise to secure a room and cases for the museum, Bliss noted that it was important to keep friends with the Turks and do nothing to shake their confidence. The Idadi, also known as Mamuniye, was built in 1893 within the walled city just inside Herod's Gate. I'm showing that to you with an arrow on the map, a location described as being convenient for travelers. The Dome of the Rock is just to the south, as you can see. One room was dedicated to the displays and the visitors had to pay an entrance fee. Bliss punctuated the unique character of this institution that exhibited the only full collection from which the history of Palestinian pottery may be studied from pre-Israelite to Roman times. By the time of its opening, it had 465 objects, mainly from excavations undertaken by PEF. Conforming to Antiquities laws and under pressure from the Directorate of the Imperial Museum, a large number of original objects were sent to Istanbul. We're talking about 400 in 1 year, the year 1900. McAllister's, Bliss's assistant, described the practice in 1902. The antiquities found during the year are now deposited in the museum here, the best things being pushed aside for sending subsequently to Constantinople. The Jerusalem Museum had to be content, he said, with what were considered second-rate objects and casts. Still, housing around 6,000 pieces in 1910, it was a major cultural institution. Indeed, its growth necessitated a larger structure, and Macready Bey, the commissioner of Ottoman antiquities, proposed to separate it from the high school and move it to the citadel, pointing to the benefit of being in a historic structure. This did not happen. The Imperial Museum Administration considered its branch in Jerusalem to be a serious institution, complete with its own catalog. The catalog's instruction divided the objects housed there into 3 classes: pre-Israelite, Jewish, and Seleucian, discovered by Bliss and McAllister. Nevertheless, there were problems. Noting that the catalog was not even printed, McAllister reported sarcastically, "The museum founded in Jerusalem with such a flourish of tempest is, like everything here, a farce. It is practically shut away from everyone, no one being admitted who has not an order from the head of the public instruction." The Directorate of the British School of Archaeology in Jerusalem summarized the Ottoman involvement in antiquities in 1920. No systematized antiquities service was maintained by the Turkish government, nor was there any methodological and scientific research work, although casual discoveries were frequently investigated by the director of the Imperial Ottoman Museum. He promised the situation would change completely under British control. In addition to high schools, government palaces and late 19th century buildings that represented the empire's centralization and modernization policies also served as museums of sort. Reinach had complained in 1883 that there were no provincial museums and that the objects found in different parts of the empire were simply transported to the nearest government palace to be stored temporarily on their way to Istanbul, although some remained there for good. Beirut's government palace, dating from 1884, sometimes called the Petit Palais or the Petit Saray, is one such example. Located at the vista of a municipal park, adjacent to the old town and designed by Bishar Efendi, the chief engineer of the province, the palace in the style of old castles was a matter of great pride for Ottoman administration. For those of you who are familiar with Beirut, this is the Place des Martyrs today, which looks nothing like that. The Baedeker Guide to Syria and Palestine reported that its courtyard, the plan of which you see on the left, the building, today it's only its foundations are left, but in this plan we clearly see that there was a courtyard. Oh, I moved too fast. Okay, there. This is not working, but okay, there, up there, you see the plan, and here's a view of the courtyard. So the Baedeker Guide to Syria and Palestine reported that its courtyard was used as an open-air museum for antiquities found in the region. Despite European claims to the contrary, the late Ottoman concern with antiquities scattered through the empire surfaced at unlikely times in unlikely places, such as a late 19th century painting titled Ruins of Baalbek by Servili Ahmet Emin Bey, who was an artillery officer, an army photographer, and an artist at the same time. Consider also a novella by Ali Kemal, Çölde Bir Sergüzeşt, An Adventure in the Desert from 1894, which takes place in Palmyra. The protagonist, a young woman from Istanbul, spends long hours among the ruins, finding food for her soul and immersing herself in the poetry and philosophy of the place. I should just anecdotally, for your amusement, I should add that Ali Kemal was the great-grandson of Boris Johnson. The investment in antique sites manifested itself in a semi-official publication in 1918 in a survey prepared by Theodor Wiegand under the auspices of Ahmet Cemal Pasha in Turkish and German. Look for Ahmet Cemal Pasha under every stone and you'll find him. Here he is too. The title Suriye ve Filistin ve Garbi Arabistan Abidat-ı Atikası, Antique Monuments in Syria, Palestine, and Western Arabia, conveys the focus given to good preservation, hüsn-i muhafaza, and good management, hüsn-i idare of antiquities in the Arab provinces. In his brief introduction, Cemal Pasha presented the volume as a strategic tool, indeed a guide to serve his project. He underlined at the same time that it was a pioneer publication, as there was no other comprehensive work in the Ottoman Empire dedicated to the valorization of historic ruins and ancient civilizations. Cemal Pasha summarized his goals in a list of concise specifications, all in accord with and reinforcing the laws then in place. Starting with the need to create a substantial management structure for the preservation of old works, he called for the clearance of debris from the antique sites and their surroundings, referring to Palmyra and the village cozily settled in the Temple of Baal that you can see in these photographs. He also urged that locals be prevented from recycling historic materials for new construction. The implied goal was to create more open-air museums similar to those in Baalbek. Cemal Pasha emphasized the importance of improving the roads and other means of transportation leading to antique sites, as well as of building accommodation facilities for foreign and Ottoman visitors. The rest of the volume consisted of 99 pages of photographic documentation, complemented with brief geographic, historic, and factual information on all the major sites and monuments in the region. All in all, this ambitious documentation can be considered as a final episode in the history of Ottoman engagement in Middle Eastern antiquities. To conclude, from the second half of the 19th century, antiquities increasingly entered into the Ottoman public discourse, sometimes following unusual venues and unintentionally challenging the definition of a traditional museum, as well as Western conceptions, I should say perhaps misconceptions of local values put on antiquities. Could it hence be assumed that placing historic objects in government buildings made them available to large groups of people who would go in and out to conduct routine business and who would not otherwise make special visits to museums? As to museums in school compounds, is it far-fetched to propose that the objects must have raised much curiosity among the teachers and the students? Would they not serve as likely references to topics covered in their history classes, which by that time included surveys of ancient civilizations? Would not these artifacts bring to real life the illustrations in history textbooks, which had attained a new format in the late 19th century? I would go further and suggest that the relegation of the policing of antiquities to a wide spectrum of public servants, the laws that prohibited their theft and smuggling, and the awards given to individuals who discovered these artifacts must have all played some role in the growing awareness of their value among ordinary people. I will add to this group the many, many laborers who worked on the excavation sites and who developed curiosity, passion, and pride in the heritage of their land, as we understand from reading archaeologists' reports against the grain. I may not be able to verify these propositions with hard evidence, but I believe that it still makes sense to ask the questions, especially in the light of the mainstream discussions of today's problems, regarding heritage sites in the Middle East. Thank you for listening to me.
So many thanks to Professor Çelik for that wonderful talk. I think we have a little bit of time for questions and discussion. And I think there is a microphone that will be passed around the room to those who would be interested in raising a question. And if you need a few more minutes to think of your question, there is one there from Professor Abulugad, I believe. And there's a microphone on its way to you.
Thank you so much. This was really so fascinating to learn about these histories that we know of, from the Arab world, and to understand their Ottoman roots. So that's, of course, one of the things that occurred to me at the beginning is the controversies now are about repatriation from European colonial powers, and it's a different story with a kind of repatriation from Istanbul. And I wondered if there was any politics around that. Anyone asking to have some of these things brought back to where they had been located since they took the best of what there was.
This is the question that comes up a lot. And Usama Makdisi was, I think, one of the pioneers in bringing that up. With my students too, we have been looking at the colonial collecting of antiquities. There's a big difference here because Ottomans in the 1880s never thought that they would lose all these lands. So when they centralized them all in Istanbul, it's not like taking antiquities from the colonies to Paris or to London, but it is really bringing them to the capital to valorize them. So their mindset was quite different than the colonial mindset there, which complicates this whole history of Ottoman colonialism or Ottoman Orientalism. And nonetheless, I have to say that Lebanon never asked for the sarcophagi, because I think they also understand the history, the specificity of the historic conditions do matter.
There's a question right here in the middle of the room.
Should have sat closer to the aisle. Professor Çelik, it's lovely to have really enjoyed this lecture. So obviously, I mean, off of Professor Abulogot's question, I was thinking a lot about Nadia Abu Hajj's work on archaeology in Palestine with regard to this lecture, which made me think a little bit. Could you tell us more about the kinds of temporal claims, the kinds of temporal arguments that were made by the Ottoman state about these pre-Ottoman, right, artifacts, and how it is that they sort of argued for a sense of sort of temporal sovereignty over these objects that precede actually, you know, the beginning of the Ottoman Empire. And I asked that just because I think what's interesting is that today, I mean, I think a lot about, for example, Göbekli Tepe, which was discovered in this, I think, 60s by a, rediscovered in quotes, by a German archaeologist. And what's interesting is that in sort of naming it a UNESCO site and sort of designating it as a part of world history of, you know, hunting, gathering, right? That's a sort of way in which governance of the site has been shared between Turkish and then non-Turkish entities as well. And so the temporal argument there of like, this is a universal like hunting gathering society sort of story is one that actually seems to govern how the sites are governed, right? So I was wondering how this sort of, these arguments of temporality and time functioned in the Ottoman context.
I'm not sure I understood everything you said, Nancy. So I don't know what to say. I think you're asking me a question about the relation of the Ottomans to the pre-Ottoman culture.
Right, yeah.
And what their arguments were. Well, it's not any different than what the Europeans do, because, you know, you construct your past. It's not an organic thing. You define your own history. And at that point, we see that the Ottoman discourse is embracing all the layers of its heritage as its own. There is a sort of pluralism there, a diversity that is characteristic of the period. It's all ours. These are our lands. We are the products of this land. And it is not, I cannot tell you that so-and-so wrote a treatise on this, but we see it when we look at the history textbooks, for example, and the way the history teaching shifts. The way it is integrated into the way antiquities are integrated into periodicals, into illustrated periodicals. Almost once every 5 issues of Servet-i Fünun has an antique site discussed on its pages. Does this answer your, is this a question?
Yeah, no, I was wondering, I mean, you know, how it worked with regard to like the Türk Tarih Kurumu and these sort of similar things. So thank you very much.
Hi. I was struck by how the language of the Imperial Museum in Istanbul resembles the language of similar museums in Europe, constructed at the same time. And in Europe, it's because they're using this language to come up with a new type of building to represent their past in a certain way. And I'm wondering, how come the Ottomans didn't reach into their own architectural history to find a suitable style for this new type of building instead of going back to the same style that the Europeans chose?
You're sounding like Solomon Reynak, who said they have their own culture. And I didn't read you the whole article. The article goes on saying, why are you concerned about antiquities? You have your own mosques, you have your own hammams, you have your own küllies, and why don't you just be satisfied with those and leave the rest to us? In fact, he went one step further. He said, why don't you sell them to us? We won't steal, we'll buy them from us. But that's not what the Ottomans were thinking at all. They were claiming the opposite, that it was part of their own heritage. And indeed, there is truth in what you're saying. Their discourse developed in response to the European discourse. They're very aware, they're extremely well aware of what's happening in European museums. They're very aware of how Europe is constructing its own past through history, and they're doing the same thing. It's a choice. It was a choice in Europe, it was a choice in the Ottoman Empire, and it gets complicated when you have many, many layers. Yes.
There's a microphone behind you.
Well, Zeynep Hanım, thanks a lot for this, very nice seminar. I just, what your last answer just made me, ask. There is a continuity over history. And I don't think it's, is exactly like you have already indicated, that that continuity for the Anatolian civilizations is not defined by, let's say, religion or Ottoman Empire. So this is also our past. So Anatolian civilization is, it goes all the way back to the 2nd, 3rd BC, and then we have our own complex layers of cultural identity, which I think is what needs to be preserved.
Absolutely, and it's also very interesting how religion does not enter the discourse, and in fact, if anything, Islamic heritage is the last to enter the Museum of Antiquities. They have the Greco-Roman, then they have the Byzantine, and then they bring in the Islamic artifacts. And they're not given the most glorious places in the museum. So religion is not an issue. It's and here I think we really have to agree with the previous question that there is a response to European museums. If British Museum has its Elgin marbles, if the Louvre has its Venus de Milo, we have our Sidon sarcophagus. A centerpiece is a must.
Question back left there.
Hi, thank you for your really fascinating talk. I was wondering, you just sort of touched on this.
Can I just suggest you pull the masks down when you're
sorry,
because it's hard to hear.
Yeah, you touched on this a little bit just now, but you started your talk with a painting showing the removal of antiquities to Europe, and I was wondering, in the period that you were focusing on, along with these laws sort of regulating or banning the export of antiquities, were there any attempts to regain antiquities that had already been exported or traded or bought or anything? And what, with the growth of like the Imperial Museum and these other branches of it, were there relationships between these institutions and the European institutions that had some of these artifacts? And what were the relationships like if they existed? Thank you.
Thank you, very, very good question. Not then, but now, yes. And indeed, the courts in New York are busy with these cases from not just the Turkish government, but so many others trying to figure out what to do with this looted antiquities. In my seminar, I have some students here from that seminar. We had a reporter from New York Times who follows just this. So he gave us a very enlightening presentation about these court cases. But then, no, they did talk a lot about it. And what is interesting about the laws and their tightening provisions is that each one of these happens after a main looting. Pergamon, another one, you just name them. And they have a restricting of the laws. Does this answer your question?
So can I ask a question? I mean, there's been these questions about the sort of difference between an Ottoman relationship to a pre-Ottoman past and, say, a British or a German or other European relationship, including in the architecture. You know, why would they copy a Greco-Roman architectural style for a museum instead of having their own? And of course, your response to that is, well, they considered that Greco-Roman heritage as part of their own. Of course, once you say that, you realize that's actually the difference, because the Ottoman Empire is part of, among other things, a Greco-Roman world in which Germany and Britain are only very, very peripherally the case. So it's not just that they're sort of imitating something. They're actually, in a sense, you know, they're not bringing artifacts from, let's say, India or Northern Europe to put on display.
They're doing that too.
Well, they may be, but there's a relationship between the place and the history that simply isn't there when imperial museums are being built in Berlin or in London or elsewhere. And, you know, and I think that sort of takes your point a little bit further. It's not just that they have every right to suggest and think about, among other, you know, various forms of pre-Ottoman or pre-Islamic history, but the way they're doing that is actually different from the way it is happening elsewhere, where places are trying to appropriate for themselves that past in a way that's different. And because it's happening on site, as it were, albeit with some movement of things, you also get this phenomenal history, which was, to me, the most interesting part of the presentation, of the development of the whole concept of an open-air museum, of Baalbek and Palmyra and so on, which, of course, you can't really do in London or Berlin. I mean, Stonehenge maybe, but I mean, compare Stonehenge to Palmyra, and I'm afraid you're going to be rather disappointed. There seems something quite pioneering about that open air aspect. I'd be interested to know if that's the case, but also quite reflective of, you know, while I don't disagree about the similarities you've been stressing to the sort of history of the building of museums and how national heritages get to be constructed, but it is happening in a different context, including one, as you say, which is not a colonial one, as it was for Imperial Britain or Imperial Germany and so on, particularly as regards these open air museums.
No, I agree with you.
And I have one other point about open air museums, which is this fascinating map you showed of Baalbek and the railway system, because of course, the other thing that's being developed around this is a tourist industry.
Yes.
And the tourist industry has been being developed in part because you've got to find a way to finance the railway network that is being built all over the empire. That also is another aspect of the way in which this is happening, that again, I think makes it a little different from the particulars of those European cases, and more interesting.
Well, thank you very much for expanding this. I do have a few words to say about the continuity of the Greco-Roman heritage into the architecture of the, shall we call it the Islamic period? Mm-hmm. Because as this is happening, the field of art history is starting to look at the Seljuk Ottoman architecture as coming from classicism as well. Mm-hmm. And how could it not? It is there, it's sitting on the land, and they look at it and think they get influence from various sides. So it's very much part of the formation mm-hmm. of the more recent periods. And I should say to Adi's question again, it isn't only the classical examples they were looking at as models in the late 19th century for a modern Ottoman architecture. They were also looking at the Islamic models. So it is, again, a mess of a scene, if you want. Everything is there. It's very diverse. It's very pluralistic, and perhaps not so aesthetically pure as some people would like it to be, but that's the case. The other thing about open air museums, yes, I honestly, this is new to me too. I was very pleased to discover that. And of all people, Osman Hamdi Bey, who's such an elitist, he doesn't care about the sentiments of the people, locals, but there they enforce their presence on him. They come and watch. And he himself writes in his accounts, they're watching. What am I going to do? Well, I'm going to have them come in and visit. The presence of these huge sites, they put a fence around it, they start charging money, and of course they have to have guards. And I think that's a very interesting phenomenon. And of course, tourist industry, it's not only, tourism is not only to antiquities, these are holy lands. There's a lot of religious tourism to this part of the world, and railroads are essential, sure.
I think we have reached the time allotted for, I'm checking with my organizers, and I think we should probably take the opportunity to thank Professor Zeynep Çelik one more time and move to the reception. Yes.